Good evening, everyone. We want to start as close to 6:30 as we can because I know folks have other places to be and things to do. Good evening. My name is Vicki Spruill, and I am the very proud president and CEO here at the New England Aquarium. And I want to welcome you all to the Boston premiere of Sea Change, the Gulf of Maine, which is a NOVA special presentation, and it will be followed by a panel discussion with members of the filmmaking team, including the aquarium's dear friend and explorer in residence and previous board member Brian Skerry, who is the man of the hour. Yeah. We are so grateful to Brian for bringing us together around the most pressing issue of our time, and of course, that's climate change. And we're delighted to be hosting and screening this conversation in partnership with GBH. Sorry, I forgot about the W drop. Tonight's event is part of our Lowell lecture series and made possible by the generous support of the Lowell Institute, which allows the aquarium to offer its lecture series free of charge. So thank you, Bill Lowell and the Lowell Institute. So Sea Change examines the changes taking place in the Gulf of Maine, the body of water that stretches from the very tip of Cape Cod to the southernmost point of Nova Scotia, one that is warming 97% faster than the global ocean. And here at the aquarium, we see these changes firsthand. We've been studying the ocean for decades, almost as long as we've been welcoming visitors. Today, though, the research conducted by the scientists in our dedicated research arm, the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life, reveals the impacts of climate change and human activities on our ocean. And we help to inform policymakers and industry practices to better protect the ocean and the marine animals who call it home. We also share our conservation mission with over 1.2 million visitors who come to the aquarium each year with the goal of inspiring them to love, to respect, to care, and to act on behalf of the ocean. Our esteemed partners at GBH share our passion for engaging audiences around the issue of climate change, and we're both spurring people to take action. It's my pleasure to introduce you to GBH President and CEO Susan Goldberg, who will share more about this commitment and set the scene for what we're about to see on the screen. Thank you all so much for coming. Susan.
Well, thank you, Vicki, and thank you all for being here tonight. I really want to thank the aquarium for the important work that you do every day to protect the ocean and the marine animals and to create climate resilient communities. That's true here in Boston and globally. This is a really very special place. So I want to give a special thanks to you all for being here, and especially to our GBH board members, supporters, and friends who are here, and those of you who are joining online. So welcome. We are really thrilled to share with you 50 minutes of clips from our new 3-part documentary series, The Gulf of Maine, which is a special presentation of our 50-year-old award-winning science series called NOVA. You can stream the entire film for free on the PBS app. You can watch it on NOVA's YouTube channel, and you can download it to any device at any time. Now, I'm really proud of this series. As I learned from my years as editor at National Geographic, climate change is a really tough story to get most people to engage in. You need just the right balance of scary stuff and hopeful solutions. And you have to show people, not just tell them, to get them to care about what is happening. And you have to get them in through the doorways that they care about most. And that's how climate change is affecting other people, charismatic animals, and beloved landscapes. So that's what this film does. and it weaves together science and natural history and some inspiring stories about what the fishers and scallopers and clammers who live and work near the Gulf of Maine are doing. And you'll see how they've adapted and continue to adapt to the fastest warming waters in the world. So this is a local story that's got a global impact. In the Gulf of Maine, the changes that they're making can be emulated by people around the world to help combat climate change. So you might know all of that, but what really sets this film apart is the stunning photography by someone who's a hero here at the aquarium and to me, and his name is Brian Skerry. Now, Brian and I had the privilege of working together for years at National Geographic, and we did all kinds of stories, including the story that became the June 2024 National Geographic cover on the Gulf of Maine and ultimately has resulted in this film tonight. So Brian knows better than anyone that with a topic like the climate crisis, seeing is believing, and believing leads to action. So Brian is going to be talking about all of this following the clips of the film. As you'll see, the series is divided into 3 parts: bounty, peril, and survival. And within a few minutes, you're going to see clips of each of these chapters. You'll see the biodiversity of the Gulf and meet sea creatures, some the size of a grain of rice, that serve as the food source for right whales. You'll watch how green crabs are taking over because of the warming waters. And most important, you'll see what fishers and scientists and entrepreneurs are doing to adapt to these changes. Plus, you'll get to see Brian at work deep below the surface at the magical Cassius Ledges 80 miles offshore. A film like this takes a village, and because we're public media, I have the privilege of thanking all of our sponsors and supporters. Major funding for Sea Change is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS. That's viewers like you. Additional funding is provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, the Richard Saltonstall Charitable Foundation, Candace J. Stern, the Cynthia C. and Seth W. Laurie Foundation, and the GBH Climate and Environment Fund. Funding for NOVA is provided by the Carlisle Companies, the Nova Science Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and PBS. Now, before we start watching, let me briefly mention a companion film series that you may be interested in. It's called Legacy of the Land, and it's a co-production between Nova's Chris Neighbors, a member of the Choctaw tribe, and Vision Maker Media. Starting this Saturday, you can find this 6-part series on Nova's YouTube channel. This is a climate change story too, told from the viewpoint of 6 different Native American communities, from Alaska to California to the desert Southwest. Here we see solutions that come from the indigenous traditions of respecting the land and the sea. And now, let's take a look at Sea Change, the Gulf of Maine, followed by a panel discussion. Enjoy the evening.
That was so powerful, and I'd now like to move us to our panel. I'd like to introduce Dr. Letise LaFeir. She's our new Chief of Conservation and Stewardship here at the New England Aquarium, who will moderate today's conversation with the filmmaking team. Before, though, coming to the aquarium, Letise served as a senior advisor to Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and NOAA Administrator, where she was a day 1 appointee in the Biden-Harris administration. She's also worked in the areas of conservation, science, policy, and international affairs at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, in NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries and the National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation. I'm so proud to call her a colleague. Welcome, Letise.
Thank you, Vicki. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here tonight for this special screening. I am pleased to be here with this esteemed panel, and I'd like to introduce you to each of them They've each played a role in bringing the sea change message to you. So you all were able to get a sneak peek, but we're going to, of course, encourage you to go watch the entire series if you haven't yet. So let me start by welcoming Brian Skerry, who's nearest to me. So you heard a little bit about him here in the film, but Brian Skerry is a photographer and producer of the Sea Change series. And it was his personal relationship, as you heard a bit in the film, with the Gulf of Maine that inspired this project. Brian is a film producer, director, and veteran photojournalist who specializes in marine wildlife and underwater realms. His recent documentary film credits include the Disney Plus series, Secrets of the Whales, if any of you have seen that one. Yes? For which he received the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Documentary as a producer. Brian has been a contributing photographer for National Geographic magazine since 1998, where he has created and photographed more than 30 feature stories, including 8 cover stories. Let's get a round of applause for that. His work has appeared in Sports Illustrated, the New York Times, and Audubon, among other publications, and he has authored 12 books. Congratulations, Brian. Actually, and so you heard history about National Marine Sanctuaries. We've crossed paths in our sanctuaries work.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So next, I'd like to introduce Laurie Donnelly, executive producer of the Sea Change series. And she's an Emmy Award-winning executive producer. Laurie oversees the GBH Lifestyle Unit, where she helps guide content and direction for some of the public television's most high-profile series, including This Old House, Ask This Old House, and Real Simple. She is also the executive producer of the Emmy Award-winning PBS series, The Victory Garden, and the public television series, Simply Ming, with celebrity chef Ming Tsai. So welcome Laurie to the podium. Next to Laurie, you saw in the film Dr. David Fields, who's senior research scientist and zooplankton ecologist at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. So we have that in common. I study blue crab zooplankton. David studies the role of zooplankton, particularly copepods, in transferring organic matter through the food web and in mediating biogeochemical cycles in the ocean. His goal to understand how the mechanisms of that occur at the level of the individual animal drive regional and global scale distribution patterns in zooplankton. Welcome, Dr. Fields. And finally, we have Chun-Wei, writer, director, and producer of the Sea Change series. Before starting a production company with his wife in 2015, Chun-Wei worked at National Geographic, the Smithsonian Channel, and with the Nature Conservancy, forming the basis of his early education in the art and science behind impactful storytelling. His passion is telling stories about our changing planet and making science entertaining and relevant to wide audiences through science and wildlife documentaries. Welcome, Chun. So we're going to do a round of questions for all the panelists, and then we'll leave some time at the end to welcome questions from the audience. So I'll start here with Brian. I understand, so you heard a little bit of your personal story here, but the rumor has it that this film series started in a parking lot of waiting in line for a food truck. And so I want you to tell us more about that, and then why, as you're standing there waiting for your food, you just landed on the Gulf of Maine.
Well, that's true. It did start in the parking lot at GBH. I happened to be there to do a radio interview with NPR, with Boston Public, and I was promoting a new book that I had out for National Geographic, and I happened to notice when I was in the lobby, I was looking at some of the information they had on the wall, the mastheads and so forth, and I saw that my old friend John Berdar, who I used to know quite regularly at National Geographic. He was a very successful producer there on the television side, but I didn't realize he had left National Geographic and was now working at GBH for several years, actually. So in the lobby, I was thinking, geez, I hope I run into John. Anyway, I did the interview. I was supposed to be coming for a meeting at the aquarium, but I was running late, so I called somebody and said, I'm not going to be able to make it. I was told by the person who interviewed me on the radio that he said, hey, I don't know what you're doing for lunch today, but we have a great Indian food truck that's going to be in the parking lot. It only comes around like once a month or so. So I thought that sounded great. Went out and stood in this very long line. And who walks up behind me but John Berdar. So we kind of catch up and, you know, what we're all up to. I was in the middle of Secrets of the Whales at that point, so I was telling John about that. And he asked, you know, what are you thinking of doing next? And I said, well, you know, I've been long wanting to do this project on the Gulf of Maine. Now there's a real urgency with this scientific paper that came out from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute that stated that it's warming 97% faster than the rest of the global ocean. I think there's a real urgency. So I'm planning to propose a story to National Geographic magazine. He said, well, you know, we should also think about doing a television series about this. That led to where we are today. It was a multi-year process. I think it's probably 5 or 6 years since that first meeting, but it all started thanks to a food truck. So.
Well, the real question is, how was the food?
It was exquisite. Yeah, it was worth the wait.
It was worth it.
Yeah.
We got the film out of that, so thank you to that food truck. Laurie, question for you. So we didn't see as much of it in the clip, but could you talk a little bit about the indigenous perspective that is included in the film and a bit about why that is? We also understand there's a short film video associated with it that figures into that approach of including the indigenous perspective.
Yes.
Can you tell us more?
I mean, I think what we have to remember is that indigenous populations have been part of Maine history for thousands of years. And in fact, they knew what we're just beginning to figure out right now, which is how to care for the land. And I think, you know, the voice that you saw in one of those clips where the man stood there and he said, if we take care of the fish, they'll take care of us. And that's the wisdom. And so right now we felt it was really important to kind of weave throughout these 3-hour programs that indigenous perspective, the new indigenous science, which is really, it was the ultimate idea and understanding of conservation, of taking care of the earth, of loving the earth, of not treating it, you know, you've said this, Brian, before, of not treating it like a commodity, but treating it with respect. And I think we're just coming back to that. It's simple, it's passionate, it's real, and I think it really is ultimately going to be the way forward. So, you know, I think it's exciting, and we really were so happy to be able to connect with indigenous scientists, with indigenous farmers, to try to bring that perspective into this series. Now, one of the things that we always do with all the series that we do is we feel like the broadcast is really just the jumping off point. In other words, that's the thing to get people motivated, and it's also why we put it online. But we also had this companion series, which Susan mentioned, and it's called Legacy of the Land. And what we did is we worked with indigenous filmmakers. We gave 6 different filmmakers from Alaska to the Southwest to Northern California, an opportunity to talk about what's going on in their community. What is a problem and what is the way in which they're dealing with it? And so we tried to kind of bring that to life, but let it be through their own voice. And they're really wonderful little stories, and they're inspirational little stories, and they really show what's possible on a very small scale.
Thank you for that. So we'll have to keep that short film in mind as well. So Dr. Fields, going down to you, so we saw your clips and your excitement at the beginning of the film. And so it's obvious you're an effective science communicator. That's part of what you were able to share in this clip. But as a scientist myself, and many scientists in the audience, I'd like to hear from you, why is that skill of science communication such an important component of the scientific process? So tell us more about your role, not only as a scientist, but being able to describe what you're learning as a scientist.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Thanks for coming.
It's interesting. So I do science, and I study a narrow group of animals that happen to be really important in how the ecosystem works. They're also really they're also really beautiful animals, and they can tell us a lot about how evolution works and how ecology works. And so I spend a lot of time in my own head and wandering down, and when I'm having discussions with other scientists, I tend to use the jargon and that kind of speech that we all understand and we're all in our own head about. But spending time with these guys, they come in it with a much broader kind of picture. And it was really educational for me to see that. And it's educational to see these kind of films where you take a small portion of what each of these individual people that are passionate about their work, and they broaden it out to show collectively how they're moving that information forward. So it's really important to communicate the science, and it often just is heard by other scientists or interns or people that are interested in going into the science. But this was for me, a really fantastic project to be engaged in because of the broadness of it and how it tied it all together.
Well, thanks for participating. And so kudos to GBH for bringing those kinds of stories to the screen. And so for you, Chun-Wei, we heard a lot of voices. So we're starting to talk about the different voices that we heard in the film. So scallopers, lobstermen, scientists, entrepreneurs. And I'm just going to stop for a moment and say I had to learn scallopers as I started working here in Boston. It's scallopers, not scallop. So could you talk a little bit about how you found these people and why you chose this collection of voices as a producer to think about that, weaving those stories together?
That was one of the, excuse me, that was one of the biggest challenges, because essentially we're trying to summarize the last 14,000 years into 3 hours. And so we knew we had to have a mix of history, science, and culture. And finding those people wasn't that hard because it's very clear who knows what they're talking about when it comes to fishermen that are out day in, day out. They know what the changes are. They've been seeing it for the past 40 years or however long their career is. The scientists are on the water day in, day out. And so finding that mix was a big challenge, but I think we've figured that one out. But yeah, it was.
What brings a good mix of perspectives?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
So we'll do another quick round and then I'll turn to the audience. Brian, we heard some about Cash's Ledge, and the series puts a lot of focus on Cash's Ledge. And so here at the New England Aquarium, we also know how special of a place is that Cash's Ledge is and how important it is to protect places like that. So why for this audience, can you explain a little bit more about why Cash's Ledge is so important to the Gulf of Maine?
Yeah, absolutely. As was brought out in the film, Cash's Ledge is a very difficult place to get to. It's 80 or 90 miles offshore. It's somewhat equidistant. It's about 90 miles from Boston. It's 90 miles from Portland, Maine, 90 miles from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And the weather in the Gulf of Maine is always a challenge. There's very few days, a handful of days, where you actually can get out there. And we're usually trying to go out with a sizable ship, maybe a 90 or 110 foot, 150 foot ship. But even then, you have to be able to dive when you get out there. But I started diving Cash's Ledge through my work with the Conservation Law Foundation about 12 years ago. And over that 12 years, I've made maybe 5 expeditions, mini expeditions out there. We'll often budget about 3 weeks of field work time to go out, but if we're lucky, we get 4 or 5 days out there just because of the weather. But from the very first time I went there a dozen years ago, I saw something that I'd never seen before in the Gulf of Maine. I've been diving these waters for 47 years. I started diving in 1977, 1978, and dove off of Rockport and Gloucester and Cape Cod, and I ran charter boats in Rhode Island and all of these things over the years. But I'd never seen a kelp forest like this place, on the top of this. It's not a true seamount by the oceanographic terminology or definition, but it is a huge rise out in the middle of this place called the Gulf of Maine. And at the very top is a place called Almond Rock. And on Almond Rock, you've got this kelp forest, which is the largest contiguous kelp forest on the eastern seaboard. And it was, for me, in some ways, like going back in time. I saw animals that I used to see regularly on coastal dives, but never see anymore. But it was also something new with that kelp forest. I'd never seen kelp that thick. When I first came down on that very first dive, and even when I was out there last year on our expedition for sea change, when you first go down, the very top of it comes up to within maybe 40 feet or so. And as you're going down, depending on visibility, you think you're approaching the bottom, but what you're actually seeing are the kelp fronds that have grown up to a height of about maybe 7 or 8 feet, and then sort of just fold over. And it's so lush and thick and healthy that it creates what looks like a false bottom. And as you actually get closer, you break through, and then you're down within the canopy, and you have to stand on the tips of your fins, your flippers, to kind of peek out over the top of it. But what you see out there is this diversity and abundance. You see codfish. Years ago in the 70s and 80s, I used to dive Cape Cod Bay or some of these other locations, and you would see codfish under rocks, rocky overhangs, or on shipwrecks. I just don't see those today. You see the sky out there is filled with schools of pollock. I never see that hardly anymore. You see wolffish, you see crabs, you see a blue mussel nursery. At certain times, cyclically, over the years, this place becomes a nursery for blue mussels, and it's just carpeted with these tiny baby blue mussels on which invertebrates feed, so sea stars and so forth. So, again, it's a difficult place to dive. Even with 5 expeditions over 12 years, I've probably seen a tiny fraction of what's out there, because it's a dangerous place to dive. The currents are unpredictable. We've never really figured out when the currents come up. Sometimes they can be very strong, and we have to put a mooring down. We put a weight with a float, and you go up and down that float, because if you came up off of it and the fog was there, because the fog comes in very rapidly and you never know what's going to happen, you could easily be drifting out in the middle of the ocean and never be found. So it's a difficult place to work. We've seen a little bit of it, but the data and the observations show that it is unique in the world, I think.
So Cassius is really important to you, but I'm switching back to you, Chun-Wei. You had so big of a role in editing the film and selecting different sequences for the film and sort of writing the narration. Is there a sequence just a single one that you think really makes the series?
So besides David's copepod sequence that you all saw, I would say the turn, the common turn on the Isle of the Shoals, just about 8 miles off the coast of New Hampshire and Maine, that really just speaks volumes. It's just a fish that is not a fish too big for the chicks, and they're adapting, they're learning. So there's plenty of hope, but it's a very striking image.
It was very striking, and I appreciated the analogy between the schools of fish and the birds working together. So speaking of memorable, David, you had a memorable line. So you're just starting to refer to a little bit, talking about the copepods, but you called them the actual charismatic megafauna in the Gulf. So using terminology like that, just broadly from your scientific perspective, how do you help viewers and others see that bigger picture, right? Really scan out, zoom out, and think about the bigger picture that you were trying to capture in that line?
Yeah, so copepods in general in the food chain form what they call this wasp waste trophic level. If I can't move my hands, I can't talk. All of that base of the food chain passes through these organisms, these copepods, and they are really, in almost all the ecosystems around the world, the most important first animal on that chain. And they're diverse, they're interesting, they're diverse, but as a group, they are that animal. And so the colonists are big for me. Most of the animals that I study are in the 500 microns. So these are 2 millimeters, they're the thickness of your fingernail. And that's a large animal in my world. And so I think of them as these giants in the world, both because of their position in the food web, how they process energy and move it around in the water column, and their importance in the globe.
A lot of personality.
And
Yeah, a
they're
lot of personality.
darling, just darling animals.
Okay, so last question for you, Laurie. Similarly, the film covered a lot of topics. So interested for you to say which sequence or character you think was the most meaningful for you and why, because it covers so many issues and so many voices. But
I mean, I think, and Chun-Wei touched on this, which is, I think the human stories are really what bring it back home again. And it's hard to communicate about climate change. It's very intellectual. People don't really get it. Some people don't really think it exists. But what we want to do is to humanize it. And I think the people's stories, I think when we kind of were editing and we were working on it, we loved the human stories. So, I mean, I always loved David and Marshall. And I think part of it is it's just because it had humor. It didn't take itself too seriously, and yet it's all very serious. And you really understand what it is. People who are committed to the seas, people who have worked out there. I mean, what you didn't see in this little clip was, so they go out, they do 5 to 8 dives. They're only allowed to go 3 days a week. They go 70 days. They're allowed 70 days period throughout the year, and they don't know what they're going to find. And at the end of it, you still see that David says at the very end, he says, "Okay, so we ended up making $800. He said, I'm going to share it here with Marshall." He says, "It's a good catch for the day." And he said, "By the way, it's my 57th birthday, and I love this fish, and at least I know where it came from." And I think it's the humanizing of it, but also what the hard work is behind it. And also the other quote that you saw here where they said, fishermen are smart people, and they're willing to adapt. And I think it's the scientists, I think it's the fishermen, I think it's the entrepreneurs who are seeing how to kind of make the best of green crabs. If you can't lick them, eat them. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's kind of bringing that back home, but that everybody's rowing forward, trying to bring about change. And I think that's the important thing. We want it to be hopeful in the end, but also realistic, and we want to bring it home in a very human way.
well, often conservation is about people, right? And so to
Absolutely.
be successful,
Absolutely.
that's what it's about. Well, I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to try my best to get through a couple audience questions. So first from in the room, and then we'll take one from online. Stand up, I see you here in the back. Ashley, is that you? I have a light in my face. Go ahead.
So I know you guys alluded to the scene with the terns that go to the Isle of Shoals, and I know that with the slender fish going further north with climate change, that the chicks are having a hard time eating the wider fish. Is there any evidence of the terns going further north with the more slender fish, or being able to accommodate for the fact that, is there any indication that they can live off of the wider fish or go further north towards the slender fish, or do you think it's almost like a end all be all for these terns because of the fact of climate change and the fact that they can't eat the fish that are now living in those areas?
So I'll summarize for the online audience. The question is, as fish move north, so we're seeing more of the butterfish going north and less of the slender fish, will the birds follow the fish that they need in any way? Are there indications that the birds are also moving north to get a better food source in?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. It's really a great, insightful question. I would answer it by saying that I'm not sure we know where the normal prey fish are exactly going. I mean, maybe they're going north, that makes sense, stands to reason. But they're primarily, their normal fish that they forage and feed to their chicks are things like sand lance, whiting, and herring. And on those years when the waters particularly warm up very hot in the Gulf of Maine, those species are just not around. So there's no evidence that I'm aware of, and again, it's really Elizabeth Craig's work out there who we should be talking to about this, but I don't think there's any evidence that nesting colony is changing. That's the place that they come to every year, have been doing it for eons, and maybe over time they will do that. but so far I don't think there's any evidence, and I'm not exactly sure where those other fish are going. The butterfish, the wider-bodied silverfish, are definitely moving up. As far as the chicks, the mortality rate on those years when their native fish are not abundant is increasing. So those chicks are dying because they either choke or can't swallow, and they spit out that butterfish. So there's data that absolutely shows that, over the last decade, the mortality rate is increasing. Will they be able to figure out a way to eat those butterfish? I don't know. I think Elizabeth suggests that maybe they have the capacity to do that, but you would think, I spent weeks out there and watching them, and you would think that maybe the parent would be able to break it up for them or, cut it up with their bill, but they don't. So it's either they eat it or they don't, but that's not to say that nature can't find a way. So, but so far, no.
Well, the good news is some of the parents are learning to pick out the correct prey fish, right? That's part of what we're hearing. Dr. Field?
Yeah, can I take a stab at that? It is a really insightful comment. And the changes, the biogeography of animals and how they move around. Animals have been adapting to changes in the climate for a long time. The problem is that humans don't adapt to them as well. So we are seeing the copepods moving north. We're seeing down in the Antarctic that the penguin colonies, they're moving further south as the krill distribution changes. And it's clear that it's all happening. But I think one of the bigger problems is that when these animals move, they move into boat lanes, they move into shipping grounds, and it's the humans that don't adapt as fast as the animals will tend to adapt. So I'm convinced that the whales will continue to find their food as their prey moves north, but they will move into places that we're not accustomed to having them, and that leads to that problem downstream.
So I'll take one question from the virtual audience. So online, this is for you, Brian. Seeing some of the film with your equipment, it seems like a lot, in caps, a lot of equipment. So questions for you. Do you use assistants on your dive? And do you ever just use your phone?
Right.
And if so, what kind of phone?
Oh, and I should also mention that, all of the great underwater footage, we hired film crews to do that. I served as a producer director in the natural history space on this series, and of course was doing my still photography both for National Geographic magazine, and then some of that was used in the series as well. But the equipment that I use is cumbersome. I'm primarily using regular cameras that all of us might use here on the surface. They just have to go inside an underwater housing, which is not only waterproof, but pressure proof. You obviously, once that camera is in there, you can't change lenses, you can't change film back in the day, or media cards today, so you're relegated to whatever lens you're going in with. So inevitably, if you put on a macro lens, a whale shark will swim by. And you'll maybe get a picture of a parasite on its tail. But so you're very limited, and even the lighting. I usually have my standard setup has a couple of underwater strobes to light my subjects, but it's kind of an old-fashioned way of photography. It's not overly creative. You're just shooting with lights on the camera, and only in certain circumstances, maybe on a coral reef where you're reasonably shallow, you can bring down supplemental lighting and do backlighting and be a little bit more creative. But if you're on the go, if I'm out shooting sharks or whales or in the middle of Cassius Ledge, it's kind of whatever you can carry. And I do have assistants, so I almost always have an assistant with me in the water to sometimes carry a second system. So maybe I'm carrying a wide angle lens and he's carrying my macro setup, and then I'll switch off as needed. And also just
like
for
a
safety.
rock star switching out guitars.
That's it, I'm spent. Yeah, that's it. That's just how I go in with a rack of guitars. And I don't use my phone underwater. You can do it. There are ways to do it, but that's I couldn't justify my day rate, Susan, if I was doing that.
But layered on top of that, besides the equipment, it's really the conditions required to film underwater. So even though we filmed over the course of about 18 months, we only had about 90 shoot days. So that's as much as the equipment, it's the conditions.
And I just wanted to add one thing, and you said it kind of under your breath, Brian, about when we went out to Cash's Ledge, and it took a long time to get the images that you see, and I think, and we were dedicated to trying to do that, but you said under your breath when we went out to Cash's Ledge, we didn't know if we'd make it out to Cash's Ledge because of environmental change, because of the storms, and we were just holding our breath, and we said, this is gonna be the centerpiece of our second film.
Right.
But you talked about how when you go under the water and the tides are so extreme, that literally, if you don't hold on to the ropes, you can get swept away and not be found again. And I think I think people have to really understand what he put at risk in order to get those images and to bring them back and to give us access to a kind of part of the world that people haven't seen before, that viewers haven't seen before. So I mean, I just say bravo to that. And we shouldn't really underestimate that, what he put at risk.
Yeah, and it's a huge collaborative effort. You know, we're hiring a ship. We worked with Yukon University of Connecticut and their RV Connecticut. It's a 100-foot, it was 120, 130-foot ship. It has dynamic positioning, means it can hold, you know, exact position, which is very helpful for like ROV work if you're doing any kind of, you know, cable work. But we could put our mooring buoy down and then have this huge ship back essentially up to within, you know, maybe 100 meters of it. We would be up current, we'd jump in the water and then sort of navigate to the buoy and then pull yourself down. But, you know, there's unique oceanography out there. It has these internal pressure waves that you just all of a sudden get pushed down, you know, 10 meters because of the way the oceanography is, the fog, the currents. So you're not venturing too far away from those mooring lines because you have to come back up there. So, but the whole film team, you know, we had cameramen using closed circuit rebreathers, doing, you know, a couple of hour dives in this cold water up there and, you know, trying to capture behavior that we hadn't seen before. So it's all part of the equation. So
as Vicki comes to wrap us lightning round, this is always the test. New England Aquarium's our mission is ocean conservation, but we want to inspire action. So one thing, rapid fire, after viewers watch the series, what's the one thing you hope they do in response?
Vote.
Amen.
I'm with the voting. No, I'm with the voting.
I'm going to have to do then a B. But the second, I would say invest in our youth.
Invest in youth. Vote, invest in youth. And Chun-Wei?
I think you can eat for a better future, so those choices.
Well, thank you all.
Crabs.
I just want to jump in real quick too, and I didn't mention this, but I'm looking at Susan Goldberg, and I think it was, I would say serendipity, but it may have been divine intervention, that my Gulf of Maine story at National Geographic was approved by Susan when she was still editor-in-chief at National Geographic. Again, it was a 4-year, 5-year process. And along the way, she came in and took over as CEO of GBH, where this project, you know, was brought over the finish line. So Susan had some mystical element to this whole thing. So that's wonderful.
Well, please join me in thanking this panel. And of course, thanking GBH for producing this film. And we will turn it back over to Vicki.
Wow, thank you, Letise, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your tenacity, your wisdom, your intellect, your commitment, and your collaboration on putting together such a moving and informative series. And thank you, Susan, for making it all happen. Tonight's event, as you know, was presented in partnership with WGBH and supported by the Lowell Institute. And our next Lowell Lecture Series event is on October 23rd, mark your calendars, when we'll welcome the 2024 MIT Carlson Lecture with Dr. Dorothy Dahl Jensen on the Greenland ice sheet. That'll be another good one. We hope you'll join us. If you're here with us in person, thank you so much to dedicating so much of your evening to this. Thank you for being with us here on Central Wharf. And to those who joined us online virtually this evening, we are so glad you did. Again, thank you all and have a good night.